Katherine Knight is one of the most chilling figures in Australian criminal history, often mentioned in the same breath as Ed Gein and Jeffrey Dahmer. A former abattoir worker from rural New South Wales, she appeared to be just another volatile woman with a troubled past, until one night in 2000, when her unspeakable actions stunned the nation. Her crime wasn't defined by the number of victims, but by the sheer brutality and grotesque detail. Uncover the dark history of this unique country with our next chapter, The Cannibal Killer, Katherine Knight. This is Australian Crime Stories. Katherine Mary Knight was born on October 24, 1955, in the rural town of Tenterfield. She was born with a twin sister into a complex family structure. Her mother, Barbara Rochen, had 4 sons from a previous marriage to Jack Rochen, before beginning a relationship with Ken Knight, Katherine's father. This new relationship was scandalous within the local community, particularly because Barbara began the affair with Ken while still married to Jack. Ken worked as a slaughterman, and he was known to have a heavy drinking problem and a volatile temper, traits that contributed to a difficult household environment. Shortly after Katherine's birth, the family moved to Aberdeen, a working-class town in New South Wales, where she was raised amid a mix of small-town gossip and economic hardship. The Knight household was emotionally unstable with constant conflict and tension, and Ken's recurrent bouts of heavy drinking fueled his aggressive behaviour at home. The two argued frequently and sometimes violently, with the children often caught in the middle. Barbara, a fiercely independent woman, was very vocal about her disdain for men and expressed bitter views on relationships to her children. Her attitude towards men and sex had a profound influence on Katherine's developing beliefs. Barbara would tell her daughters about the dark side of sexual relationships and conveyed a belief that men were to be distrusted and controlled. This largely shaped Katherine's own later complex and troubled views on intimacy, power, and trust. One of the most significant and tragic elements of Katherine's childhood was her experience of sexual abuse. According to psychological assessments made during her adult life, Katherine was sexually abused by several male relatives repeatedly until around the age of 11. Whilst her family initially denied these claims, it's widely believed to be true. In fact, her half-brother, Neville Knight, was a youth worker who has been sentenced to 18 years for abusing 11 boys in his care. Katherine attended Muswellbrook High School, where she was known as a bully who could be aggressive both physically and verbally. She was socially isolated, struggled to form lasting friendships, and had difficulty trusting others. Teachers remembered her as unpredictable, at times compliant and quiet, at others explosive and violent. There were incidents where she physically attacked both students and teachers, which alarmed school staff but did not lead to significant interventions. Katherine left school around age 15, largely illiterate and lacking in basic skills, limiting her prospects. She took a series of odd jobs but soon secured a position at the local abattoir at around age 17 or 18 years old. This followed her father's footsteps, and she considered it her
dream job.
She quickly rose to a position that involved handling knives and butchery tasks, and with that she became fascinated with knives. This was a fixation that persisted throughout her life. She was known to proudly display her set of knives above her bed in her homes, a habit she explained as
wanting them always close at hand.
This attachment to weapons is often seen by psychologists and psychiatrists as a symbolic representation of power and control. They also say Katherine showed traits consistent with borderline personality disorder and antisocial behaviour, including intense mood swings, impulsivity, and difficulty controlling anger. Her relationships with family and peers were fraught. She could be both intensely loyal and cruelly punitive, showing a deep ambivalence toward attachment and trust. Her mother's cynical views on relationships seemed to echo in Katherine's own developing ideas. She tended toward possessiveness and control in personal relationships. There are unconfirmed but persistent reports that, even in her youth, Katherine showed signs of cruelty to animals, including an incident where she allegedly strangled a dog. While these accounts were never fully investigated, animal cruelty is often considered an early warning sign in the development of violent behaviour. Katherine Knight's first significant relationship was with David Kellett, a former railway worker she met in the early 1970s. Kellett was known to be a heavy drinker, struggling with trauma from his work, including the deaths of close colleagues in railway accidents. Despite his issues, the two formed a fast bond, and Katherine became highly possessive of him. They married in 1974 when Katherine was just 19 years old. On their wedding night, she tried to strangle him because he fell asleep after only having sex 3 times. This incident set the tone for a marriage plagued by jealousy, violence, and erratic behaviour. Katherine regularly assaulted David, once hitting him over the head with a frying pan, and another time slashing his face with broken glass. In 1976, they had a daughter, Melissa Ann, but the relationship continued to spiral into physical and psychological abuse. At one point, Katherine burned all of Kellett's clothing and smashed his belongings after an argument. Fearing for his life, Kellett eventually fled the relationship, and Katherine was left on her own with their baby. After David Kellett left her, Katherine suffered a complete breakdown. In a deeply disturbing incident, she placed her infant daughter on a railway track shortly before a train was due to pass. Fortunately, a local man rescued the child in time. That same day, she threatened multiple people with a stolen axe. She was subsequently institutionalized in a psychiatric hospital where she was diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, but she was released shortly after. Despite the incident, she regained custody of her daughter. About a decade after her first marriage, Katherine entered a new relationship with David Saunders, a local miner. The relationship quickly became toxic, following a familiar pattern. Katherine became emotionally dependent, violently possessive, and terrifyingly aggressive. When she suspected Saunders of cheating or spending time away from her, she would throw him out of the house, only to beg him to come back. In one of the most horrifying incidents from this period, Katherine slit the throat of Saunders' 2-month-old dingo pup in front of him to demonstrate what she would do if he ever left her. They had a daughter, Natasha Marie, in 1988, but the relationship deteriorated under the weight of Katherine's escalating violence. After repeated threats and attacks, Saunders finally fled the relationship and went into hiding, fearing for his life. Katherine later took out a restraining order against him, despite being the abuser in the relationship. Soon after her split with David Saunders, Katherine began a new relationship with John Chillingworth, a former co-worker from the abattoir. This relationship was relatively brief compared to the others, and was reportedly less violent, at least on the surface. In 1991, they had a son, Eric, together. However, the relationship ended abruptly when Katherine began an affair with John Price, a local father of 3 whom she had met in Aberdeen. Chillingworth reportedly left her not long after discovering the affair. Across all these relationships, Katherine Knight displayed a clear and escalating pattern of abusive behaviour. She was physically violent, emotionally manipulative, and deeply unstable. Each partner was initially drawn in by her charm and intensity, but eventually fled in fear for their safety. By the time she met John Price, she had already left behind a trail of destructive relationships, hospitalizations, and domestic violence, and gained a reputation in her community as dangerous and unpredictable. Katherine Knight met John Charles Thomas Price when she was 38 years old. John was a well-liked father of 3, known for his steady temperament, sense of humour, and long-time employment in the mining industry. Despite Katherine's reputation for volatility, he was initially drawn to her. Their relationship progressed quickly. By 1995, Katherine had moved into John's home along with 2 of her daughters from previous relationships, while John's 2 older children also lived there. Friends and neighbours described the relationship as passionate but stormy, and problems began surfacing soon after they moved in together. Katherine was intensely jealous, controlling, and possessive. If she suspected John of any disloyalty, she would lash out with verbal abuse and, at times, physical violence. John tolerated her behaviour for several years, perhaps out of emotional dependence or a sense of responsibility to keep the household stable for their children. But the relationship took a serious turn in 1998, when John refused Katherine's repeated desire to marry. She retaliated by secretly recording and reporting him for taking some expired medical kits from work, items that had no actual value and were destined for disposal. Her actions led to John being fired from his job of 17 years, a job he greatly valued. In response, he threw her out of the house and ended the relationship. Despite this betrayal, they eventually reconciled a few months later. However, John made it clear that she would not be moving back in. From that point on, their relationship existed in a toxic on and off cycle, with frequent arguments, manipulation, and escalating tension. John's friends and co-workers grew increasingly concerned and repeatedly warned him to leave her for good. John himself told several people that he feared for his life and made it clear that if anything ever happened to him, Katherine Knight would be responsible. By early 2000, their relationship had deteriorated to a point where it was barely functional. Katherine's behaviour had become even more erratic and aggressive. She remained obsessively attached to John, yet simmered with resentment over his refusal to marry her or let her move back into his home. Despite the red flags and dire warnings from those around him, John continued to see her, an entanglement that would ultimately prove fatal.
She's not right in the head, but I can handle it.
On the morning of the 29th of February 2000, John Price went to the Scone Magistrates Court and filed for a restraining order against Katherine. He told others that he wanted her kept away from both himself and his children, and he was planning to end the relationship for good. That same day, at work, John repeated his concerns to his colleagues at the mine, explicitly stating that,
If I don't come to work tomorrow, it's because she's killed me.
Meanwhile, Katherine Knight was preparing for something that appeared, in retrospect, to be both calculated and symbolic. She visited her daughter and spoke to her cryptically, as if saying goodbye. She also purchased a set of new black lingerie. Back at home, she recorded a strange and rambling video message, which some interpreted as a kind of will. In the recording, she made disjointed comments about her children, her belongings, and unresolved grievances with people in her life. While it wasn't an overt confession, it gave the impression that she believed something major was about to happen, or more so, that she planned to make it happen. That night, John returned home alone after work. He had dinner, talked briefly with neighbours, and went to bed around 11 p.m. Katherine arrived at John's house later that evening. She let herself in, as she had done many times before, and found John asleep in bed. She first watched television for a while in another room. At some point during the night, presumably in the early morning hours of March 1st, Katherine entered the bedroom. She woke John up and they had sex. Whether this was consensual or coerced is unknown, but forensic evidence showed they had intercourse before he went back to sleep. Once John was asleep, Katherine retrieved a boning knife from her proud collection. With John lying in bed, unarmed and unaware, she began stabbing him repeatedly, mainly concentrated around his chest and back. John wakes to the terror and tries to fight her off with his hands, severely cutting them in the process. He managed to get out of bed and flee down the hallway, leaving trails of blood smeared across walls, door frames, and switches as he tried to escape. He managed to reach the front door and even opened it. Neighbours later reported hearing a loud thud around 2 to 3 a.m. Despite his best efforts, John would ultimately die from massive blood loss, likely within minutes. He sustained at least 37 stab wounds, 28 of which were considered deep and fatal. What happened next was the most shocking and depraved part of the crime. After John was dead, Katherine began flaying his entire body. Using her butchering skills, she removed the skin in one piece, from the face down to the legs, including his ears, scalp, and genitals. Such complete flaying is extremely rare in criminal cases and is often interpreted by forensic psychologists as an act of total dehumanization, a way of symbolically stripping the victim of identity and autonomy. The only cases of human flaying since Katherine are committed by the cartel. Katherine then decapitated John and proceeded to cook parts of his body. She placed his head in a large stock pot, added vegetables, and began boiling it on the stove. She then cut pieces of flesh from his buttocks and thighs, roasting them in the oven with baked vegetables. She arranged the cooked meat in a serving dish. Next to them, she laid 2 place settings out neatly, complete with name tags bearing the names of Price's son and daughter. This disturbing staging suggested that Katherine had intended to serve them their father's remains, or at the very least to emotionally destroy them by creating such a monstrous scene. On this night, his children were luckily not at home. They were staying with friends or elsewhere that night, and, thankfully, did not witness the murder or its immediate aftermath. A 3rd plate of cooked meat and vegetables was later found in the backyard, discarded in the grass. This could have been intended for John's 3rd child, who didn't reside at their home. Alternatively, she could have prepared the meal for herself, but was ultimately unable to bring herself to consume it. Katherine also left a handwritten note on top of a photograph of John. The note was smeared with blood and pieces of his flesh and contained a series of false accusations, including claims that John had raped her daughter and engaged in other forms of abuse. These allegations were later investigated and proven to be completely fabricated, a last-minute attempt to justify the crime or to create the appearance of motive and provoke sympathy. After staging this elaborate and gruesome scene, Katherine acted on taking her own life by ingesting an overdose of prescription medication and laying on John's bed with the note of false allegations. On the morning of the 1st of March 2000, John Price failed to show up for his shift at the mine where he worked. With his warnings only the day before, colleagues became immediately concerned and tried to contact him. After no response by phone, they drove to his home to check on him. When they arrived, they noticed his car still parked in the driveway, but there was no answer at the door. At this point, they alerted the local police, fearing that something was seriously wrong. Officers from the Scone police station arrived shortly after 8 a.m. As police approached the front door of the home at 84 St Andrews Street, they found the door locked, but noticed blood smears on the handle and streaks of blood on the porch. Peering through the windows, officers could see further blood inside. Believing a serious crime or injury had occurred, they forced entry into the home. They were immediately hit by an overwhelming stench. The walls and floor were spattered with blood. In the living room, they discovered John's headless, skinned body, laid out with one arm draped over a soft drink bottle. The positioning was unnatural and appeared staged. His skin was hanging on a meat hook in an archway between the kitchen and lounge room. Moving into the kitchen, police found the large stock pot with John's decapitated head. The pot had been cooking for hours, filling the house with the nauseating smell. Finally, police found Katherine Knight herself in a coma-like state on the bed with her note of false accusations of John. The officers immediately called for paramedics and backup, securing the crime scene. Katherine was taken to hospital under police guard, while forensic teams began processing the murder scene. This murder was not only an act of unimaginable violence, it was deeply symbolic, methodical, and theatrical. The combination of revenge, sadism, and grotesque culinary preparation made it almost ritualistic in nature. Experts later stated that Katherine's intention was not just to kill John, but to destroy his identity, humiliate him in death, and emotionally devastate his children in the most perverse way imaginable. Although she was not formally interrogated immediately due to her medical condition, police placed her under arrest for the murder of John Price that same day while she was still in the hospital. This discovery and arrest sent shockwaves throughout Australia. Hardened homicide detectives described the scene as the most horrific they had ever witnessed, and forensic teams required counselling afterward. John Price's family, especially his children and siblings, were completely devastated by the news of his murder. When the crime scene was made known to them, his children were traumatised. Price's daughter later described feeling sickened and shattered. Although the media did not initially release the most graphic details to the public, the children were informed privately. One of his brothers described the murder as being
like something out of a horror movie.
Katherine was later transferred to the Morisset Psychiatric Hospital, where she was placed under observation and evaluated. During her stay there, she claimed to have no memory of the attack, the mutilation, or the cooking, a stance she would maintain for some time. Despite her mental health issues, psychiatrists concluded that she was not psychotic, not delusional, and fully capable of understanding right from wrong. She was therefore found fit to stand trial under New South Wales law. Katherine was formally charged with the premeditated murder of John Price. Her legal team were aware that the evidence was insurmountable, particularly the detailed forensic trail. Her defence initially rested on diminished responsibility and a claim of amnesia, suggesting she may have committed the act while in a dissociative or psychotic state. The trial was scheduled to begin on the 15th of October 2001 in the New South Wales Supreme Court in Newcastle. Due to the graphic nature of the case, extra security and media restrictions were in place. The court prepared for a gruesome, high-profile hearing, with jury selection completed and opening arguments ready. But in a last-minute twist, Katherine's legal team unexpectedly announced that she would change her plea to
Guilty.
This occurred without warning, and prosecutors were caught off guard. The judge, Justice Barry O'Keefe, paused the proceedings and ordered an independent psychiatric assessment to confirm that her change of plea was informed, rational, and voluntary. 3 independent forensic psychiatrists interviewed Knight again. All agreed she was mentally unwell but not mentally incompetent. She understood the charges, the consequences of a guilty plea, and the life sentence that would follow. She chose not to contest the evidence, likely to avoid a prolonged public trial. With no trial necessary, the case proceeded to a sentencing hearing in November 2001. The Crown presented the full, graphic summary of the murder and its aftermath. The courtroom was reportedly silent and visibly distressed as the horrifying details were read aloud. John Price's children and relatives submitted written and spoken victim impact statements describing the psychological devastation, ongoing nightmares, and inability to live normal lives since his death. One of his children said,
"I will never forget the way I found out what happened to my father. No child should ever have to hear such things."
They detailed their struggles with PTSD, depression, grief, and trauma-induced anxiety. Some left school or work. Others required years of therapy. The crime robbed them not only of a father, but of a sense of safety and humanity. On November 8, 2001, Justice O'Keefe sentenced Katherine Knight to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, ordering that her papers be marked.
Never to be released.
His remarks were scathing.
This was a crime of unspeakable barbarity. Premeditated, sadistic, and executed with calculated cruelty. This prisoner is incapable of rehabilitation and should never be released into society.
She became the first woman in Australian legal history to be sentenced to life without parole. Katherine Knight was transferred to the Silverwater Women's Correctional Centre in Western Sydney, one of Australia's highest security prisons for female offenders. Given the notoriety of her crime and the risk posed both by and to her within the prison environment, Katherine has been kept under strict conditions. She is housed in a protective custody unit, segregated from the general prison population. Reports indicate she is often confined to her cell for the majority of the day, with limited interaction outside of supervised activities. Given her high-profile status, media and visitor access are heavily restricted. Prison officers and staff who have encountered Katherine over the years describe her as emotionally cold and manipulative. In 2006, Katherine appealed her sentence to the New South Wales Court of Criminal Appeal, claiming that life without parole was too severe for someone with mental illness and a traumatic past. She also claimed the sentence was manifestly excessive. However, the three-judge panel unanimously rejected the appeal. In their decision, the judges stated,
This was one of the most appalling cases to come before the courts in this country. The original sentence was entirely appropriate.
The High Court of Australia refused her any further avenue for appeal. Katherine Knight remains in custody at the Silverwater Women's Correctional Centre in Western Sydney, under protective custody. She has no access to the public and is not eligible for parole, release, or work programs. She is now in her late 60s and will die in prison. Katherine Knight's descent into infamy is not just the story of a murder. It's the story of obsession left unchecked, of warnings ignored, and of darkness that wore a human face. Behind her chilling actions was a lifetime of trauma, rage, and manipulation that escalated until it shattered the lives around her. Her crime didn't just end one life, it scarred many, forever altering a quiet community that never imagined such horror could exist in their midst. The memory of what she did lingers like a shadow, a reminder of how terrifyingly far a person can go when their hatred turns methodical, and when no one truly believes the warnings until it's far too late. This has been Australian Crime Stories, the cannibal killer Katherine Knight. Don't forget to follow us on your listening platform for weekly episodes. You can also follow us on Instagram and TikTok for short crime videos.